Menagerie, let's talk about some movies.
Starting off the month, I watched the A24 horror film Talk to Me. I'm a horror fan, but I usually don't go to the theaters for them unless I hear good things. So after several recommendations, I had to see what the hype was about. And folks, this didn't disappoint. Talk to Me is about a group of friends that do seances at a party through a cursed human hand until the games go too far. Maybe it was the devil's lettuce I enjoyed before the screening, but I legit had a mini panic attack during this movie, and I think that's a compliment to the film. I hadn't heard of them before, but YouTubers Raka Raka directed this, and so I tried to pay attention to the filmmaking aspects, but was quickly swept up into the story and scares, thanks to convincing performances, especially by Sophia Wilde as Mia. Next is another film that I had always heard good things about, and that's The Great Captain Phillips, directed by Paul Greengrass. Coming from the guy who made the Bourne series, it shouldn't have been surprising that he knows how to make a tense thriller, but the escalation throughout kept me on the edge of my seat. I think they spent a little too long in the lifeboat at the end, but the performances and cinematography were fantastic and realistic. Fair warning, you might get a little motion sickness because they're actually on a boat, not a green screen, but the handheld camera being constantly obscured by beams and ship parts adds to the verisimilitude and danger that's hard to come by these days. Since Halloween is coming and I'm working on another video about spooky kids movies, I put on Wendell and Wild from 2022. This is another stop-motion wonder from Henry Selick, the mind behind Coraline and The Nightmare Before Christmas, to name a few. Coraline is one of my favorite movies of all time, and if you know the ending of that film, Wendell and Wild has a sort of reversal of themes that contrast beautifully to Cat's angsty punk attitude and aesthetics. Obviously, the visuals are super cool and original, but the soundtrack is equally unique. If you're an old or new fan of punk music, this has a legitimate soundtrack full of deep-cut bands that I, and probably a lot of people, have never even heard of. Gives you something to discover after the credits roll. Highly recommend. So I'm going to keep this one short because I've seen this movie several times and I liked it a lot when it first came out. It became one of those kinds of action movies that you can just put on in the background because it's loud and colorful. However, after this rewatch, I noticed how the film is mostly held together by Margot Robbie's portrayal, which is excellent. And I have to give it credit for being a story about having a support group of friends to talk to after a breakup. Still one of the more fun DCEU movies, but yeah, it has depreciated a little over time. Next up is one I haven't rewatched in years, but I am so glad I did because it's, if not the best Pixar film, definitely near the top. Every other line is a joke with two seasoned pros like Billy Crystal and John Goodman as your leads, but there's just as much heart and, for lack of a better word, humanity. From the character designs to the heady sci-fi concept of doors being portals to other worlds, this was the first Pixar movie to go beyond anthropomorphizing non-human objects like Toy Story, A Bug's Life, and Cars, showing the creative potential of animation as well as the audience's ability to appreciate unconventional ideas. I'll probably go into this movie more in another video, but it's got a 5-star rating from me on Letterboxd. I mean, you can't beat that iconic Randy Newman soundtrack. Teen Titans Go to the Movies is a cute, goofy animated flick that really follows through on its title's promise. This is really for hardcore fans of superhero movies and TV, as well as anyone into the movie-making process in Hollywood. Full disclosure, I currently work at Warner Brothers, and seeing how some of the stages and various areas of the studio lot were faithfully reproduced in animated form, it gets a couple bonus points for me. To think, I have stood where the Teen Titans stood. Such an honor.
This place is amazing, yo.
They're really making movies about every superhero.
And it's time they make one about me. Come on.
Plus, any fans of the original 2003 series on Cartoon Network will appreciate the little post-credit scene setting up the next in this series, but yeah, this was pretty much just a fun light watch. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. Despite a mouthful of a name, this was a pleasure to watch. The visuals were of course stunning from start to finish, and I love when movies use multiple styles of animation, but unfortunately the pacing on this one kind of hurt it. There are several flashbacks with origins that, like Spider-Man and Batman, I don't know if it's really necessary after this many incarnations, but that didn't take away from the charming performances from the actual teenage voice cast. The third act gets a little big for its britches, but it was cool to see something kind of different for the turtle world. Not super different, but just enough to update it for the TikTok generation. In a good way. Now, to do a complete 180 from the animated binge, I watched the erotic thriller The Devil's Advocate. Why? It's just one of those ones you hear about over the years, and the Rewatchables podcast did an episode on it, so what the hell. I'll just say, this movie is a ridiculous yet philosophical exploration that could have only been made in the 90s. One scene will go from Keanu Reeves facing sexual temptations of threesomes to Al Pacino screaming about ethics to Charlize Theron mentally breaking down, and oh yeah, we'll throw in a couple court scenes every now and then. This tonal whiplash made for a fun watch, but not a very cohesive one. It loses the courtroom drama aspect for a less fun subplot, and everyone seems to be in different movies with performances that are all over the place. This one isn't technically a movie, but a docuseries on Netflix that I was very late to the game on watching. I didn't want to watch this for years because I had always thought that the rise of true crime entertainment was a terrible sign for our times, which is exactly what the docuseries, in a direct look into camera on the nose way, asks viewers. Does this kind of infatuation with serial killers fuel the very creation of these monsters? Is it an Ouroboros of bloodlust? In our modern digital world of social media likes, viral fame, and movies starring hot boy actors as real-life murderers, it's definitely plausible. However, I'd prefer to think that no, these people always needed help long before the idea of infamy came into their minds, but with only 3 one-hour-long episodes, decide for yourselves. As a kid of the 90s, I was a voracious Goosebumps reader, so I obviously had some biased feelings going into this movie. And while it's a fun, family film, it doesn't feel very Goosebumps. It has its moments, like the giant praying mantis or Slappy's first appearance, but Jack Black doing a strange accent throughout was distracting. The supporting cast was fine, and the CG is already dated. I get why they did an epic Inkheart style plot where all the stories show up in a big finale, but it's definitely more of an adventure film than a spooky one. Still, it's part of the kids' horror oeuvre that, as I mentioned earlier, I plan to cover later. Next, I watched The Rundown free on Tubi, and it's kind of the perfect Tubi movie. A sort of cool but also dumb action flick with 2 lovable leads that you can just throw on any random afternoon. Starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson before he had a can't get hurt clause in his contract, and Seann William Scott at the height of his powers, this odd couple duo of a bounty hunter and his bounty is a classic Hollywood formula that just works. Albeit for some reason the version on Tubi was pretty low res, maybe 720 at best, so this was a little harder to watch. That said, the stunts, and not to mention real locations, make this a much more bearable watch than similar modern green screen diarrhea. Bringing a much needed jolt and sudden euphoric burst of energy into the watch list is Cocaine Bear. I tried to watch this earlier this year, and probably because my attention span has been obliterated by TikTok, I couldn't get into it, but gave it a second chance and actually had a great time. I think it introduces a few too many characters at the beginning, but once this wild story about family and drugs gets going, it's a lot of fun. The gore is surprising and awesome, plus the jokes mostly land. You don't get this type of movie very often that balances the tone this well, but coming from the fantastically comedic and talented Elizabeth Banks, I should expect no less. This is probably actually a really dope kickback movie, especially if it happens to be snowing outside, you know what I'm saying? Since I am a man that contains multitudes, I'm just kidding. A female friend of mine sat me down to finally watch this wonderful little rom-com that I had woefully ignored over the years. I know the women watching this are probably screaming at me, but better late than never. The holiday sees Kate Winslet and Cameron Diaz's characters swap houses and meet unlikely pairings in Jack Black and Jude Law just before Christmas. Kate Winslet acts circles around the rest of the cast, but Jack Black as a charming romantic lead was a cool unconventional take. A very sweet and funny, happily ever after kind of movie that's just as sugary as the holidays it's named after. Alright, these next 2 were just on cable when I stayed at a hotel, and it was the first time rewatching them in a few years. The first one, aside from a couple dated jokes, was actually still pretty funny line to line. A joke every few seconds. The second one, not so much. Whether it was a less funny script or the improv just wasn't as natural on part 2, that light-hearted stupidity felt a little more forced. That said, I think I prefer the setting of Thailand in part 2 because it does add to the stress and confusion to really put you in the character's mindset compared to The Hangover part 1. Saving one of the best for last, Lost in Translation to me is one of those movies that either resonates with you at a young age or you purposefully wait until you're older because you know you probably aren't emotionally mature enough for it yet. I was the latter. I remember people talking about this movie when it came out 20 years ago, but now, finally having watched it, it's clear to see why it's so beloved. Bill Murray gives a phenomenally subtle performance as an actor named Bob on the edge of retirement and a midlife crisis who finds a new spark of life when he meets Scarlett Johansson's young, yet bored housewife, Charlotte. The chemistry between these two of vastly different ages is unexpectedly charming, and while most of the film feels like a rare and beautiful example of platonic male-female friendship, personally I feel like it's slightly cheapened by Bob kissing Charlotte in the final moments. Maybe I'm in the minority, but after hearing this was improvised by Murray and not in the script, it sort of ironically lessens the tragic and romantic forbidden quality of their undefined love. The movie up until that point is about two potential soulmates that met at somewhat incompatible ages, not to mention both being married, and thus, like two ships passing in the night, they'll never be able to consummate that love. Instead of ending with a feeling of the one that got away or what could have been, it feels more like Bob finding a new vitality for life with the bonus of getting a kiss from one of the most beautiful people on the planet, while Charlotte is left to struggle with decisions of divorce in a rocky marriage. At least there was no tongue, I guess. That's just my opinion on the ending, but everything else from the handheld camera and Tokyo setting to the shoegazy soundtrack make this definitely one of the best films, possibly, of all time.